last week, Steve, it's going to be total mayhem, and maybe even today, but certainly tomorrow. It's not a matter of if the big one happens; it's a matter of when. And the closer we get to the end of the race, the more anticipation happens with that big one. Talk with us a little bit about. We like to watch that. We like to see the carnage. We don't want to see anybody hurt, but the big one is bound to happen tomorrow, Steve.
There's no doubt that it's going to happen, and sometimes it's just a matter of when it's going to happen. I mean, it was so strange in the clash. We saw the whole field being taken out on a green flag run, and they weren't even up to speed yet. So, if it can happen in racing, it will happen in racing, and that's what I kind of always say about those situations. But the impatient parts are going to come in at the end of the stages with people trying to jockey for position, trying to get some stage points. So, we've traditionally seen some of these wrecks or even smaller incidents happen around those times. But, yeah, as you start to close in on laps, last 10, 15, 20 laps or something like that, these teams are really just going to be up on the wheel. The friendships have gone out the window. The teammates gone out of the window. The manufacturers have gone out the window. And we're liable to see a lot of 2 and 3 and 4 wide racing out there towards the end of the race, and inevitably it will probably end in calamity like it typically has. Although, I mean, we've seen some of these races go long green flag runs, and we thought that this 3 and 4 wide racing would create calamity, and it didn't. But these are supposed to be the best race car drivers in the world, and a lot of them, it's through no fault of their own that they get caught up in these incidents.
Speaking of incidents, Tony, we'll ask you about this. Last week, one of the big wrecks that we saw involved Brad Klobosky, Joey Logano, Kurt Busch, or Kyle Busch, one of the Bushes, I'm sorry. And a lot of this had to do with Joey Logano doing what we call a double block. And if you're going to block, okay, that's fine. And you're going to go up high, that's fine. If you're going to go low, but pick your lane to stay in it. He didn't do that, but I think a lot of it could be attributed to a racing incident. But certainly in the moment, it created one of the big wrecks, one of the bigger wrecks that we saw. And certainly karma came back to bite them later on in the race. But when you look at that, would you consider that wreck, particularly with Brad Klobosky, Kurt Busch, that whole group there, a result of something that Joey Logano could have done better or different?
Well, when you kind of look at it, it was interesting because they're teammates, and Keselowski had some good comments after the race about Disney World and dealing with it. Look, here's the bottom line: is when you're out front, you're almost a sitting duck, and you have to block. You block the lane with the momentum, and sometimes you make that block a split second too late, and it ends up in carnage. But the fact of the matter, especially late in the race, as you guys were talking about, when it's down in the nitty gritty and we see these wrecks, is because if you don't block the lane that's coming, and you get hung out to dry in a third lane with no help, you go from first back to 15th, and you can't afford to do that with 10 laps to go. Now, you would hope that in the first, 350 miles of the race tomorrow that people would give up those positions and know they can work their way back. But with 10, 15 laps to go, when it gets down to the money laps, you got to block those lanes, because if you let another lane get momentum, whether it's the top or the bottom, you can easily go from first back to 8th, 9th, 10th real quick. So it's just about making those blocks at the right time. Richie Stenhouse Jr. is the guy that I'm going to watch for tomorrow, starting on the pole. He's feast or famine at these super speedway races. He's won a couple of Talladega, but he normally ends up being involved or starting the big one. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, especially late in the stretch. You would hope that they would ride around, 2 lanes, maybe 3 lanes for the first 200, 250 miles, and then get to that final pit stop after that final stage where you got a good run and settle in. So it's just about making the block at the right time and put yourself in position to stop the momentum of the lane that's coming.
Well, we know that starting at the pole doesn't always equate to a big win in Daytona, well, Indianapolis either, for that matter. Joining us from Daytona, Florida, is Steve Wilson of Speedway Digest. We appreciate you joining us, Steve. And Tony Donahue of the Tony D podcast joining us. We're talking about the Daytona 500. Steve, let's talk about the farewell tour of Jimmy Johnson begins this week was pretty much already begun. I'm sure that Daytona Speedway has something special in line for Jimmy Johnson, but what do you know about what they've got planned, and what are they going to do there in Daytona tomorrow to honor Jimmy Johnson?
Yeah, they. I mean, just like we've seen in previous years, for every driver that has come through and retired in the last couple of years, Jeff Gordon, Tony Stewart, etc. They're gonna go out there and they're gonna roll the red carpets out for him. They're gonna show some of the accomplishments that he's over his career in NASCAR, his 7 championships that he's been able to accumulate over that time. So there's a lot of different things that they're going to put together, and this is going to be an ongoing thing that we're just not going to see at Daytona for every track that he goes to from this point on out. They'll have something in their own way or another, and some tracks he's been more successful at than the others, and speedway racing for him has had not necessarily been the greatest for him. He's had that roller coaster up and down. He's had some of the highest of the highs, but more of the low of the lows, but I guess a lot of people could say that in speedway racing. But I think we expect some. I guess we still kind of look at what Richard Petty and Dale Earnhardt Dale Earnhardt Sr. were able to do at these speedway races, and even Richard Petty won 7 times. Dale Sr. only won once. It took him over 20 years of trying to get this thing done, and he finally did it. So. I guess we look at some of the other greats in speedway racing, and for Jimmy Johnson, for all the accomplishments that he had, I think a lot of times it's right on par as to some of these other champions. I guess Richard Petty's the anomaly in the fact of winning 7 Daytona 500s, but even Jeff Gordon and a lot of these other guys have won Daytona 500s, but they've just had low of lows, and for the track to go out there and acknowledge some of those accomplishments that he has had and the victories that he has pulled out there in Daytona, and all the tracks that are about to come up throughout the remaining schedule was just a testament of who Jimmy Johnson is and the career he's built, and all the wins that he's put up on the board and records he's broken, and just some of the things that we've seen in the modern era that we never thought would ever be accomplished.
Well, we got the Xfinity race today, guys, and a lot of more action out there at the Daytona Speedway. Tony, we look at this Xfinity race as far as standing-wise. Tyler Reddick, Cole Custer, Christopher Bell, Justin Allgaier, and Chase Briscoe round out the top 5. And Ford, as you mentioned earlier, certainly being the dominant force in the Xfinity series. As we look at today's race, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see who comes up with partnerships, who's going to be, there at the end. Reddick is a guy who's running the Daytona 500. He's got a lot of experience. You look at some of the other – I really like Chase Briscoe. He's out of Mitchell, Indiana. He's always fast, so look for him to stay up front. But, yeah, there's a lot of inexperienced drivers in this as well that are going to have a chance to really compete. So you tend to look towards the guys like Justin Allgaier that have the experience in this race to be up front throughout the day. But what I really like about this race is, like we saw last night in the Truck Series, Natalie Decker finishing in the top 5 last night. Anderson was second. Nobody really had even heard of him. It's just about getting towards the front and staying up there and having a chance because, and there's going to be a lot of Cup Series drivers that are watching this race today, knowing that, hey, what can I learn? What's going on with the top lane, with the bottom lane that I can use tomorrow? You keep an eye on a guy like Noah Gragson. He's always seems to be aggressive, seems to be a guy who can find himself up towards the front. And there's just a lot of young talent in today's race that I think is going to have a chance to possibly put themselves in victory lane or at least a position to win for the first times in their career.
Steve Wilson, you're down there in Daytona. You're down there in the thick of it all. You're going through the garages. You're going to the press conferences. Give us the look and feel of what's going on in Daytona this weekend as these teams get ready for the Daytona 500. What are some of their strategies? What are some of the things that the teams are looking at? What are some of the things that you have noticed down in the pits and the garages and the press conferences of the Daytona 500 this year?
I mean, we've got a lot of people still kicking the rust off from the off season, but you know, as it has in the past, it continues to be these teams inch closer and closer of working together, and you know, Ford has done a really good job over it after the last couple of Daytona 500s or so, that they've really changed the dynamic in which these races run. And for a while there, they were kind of powerhouses into the way that they, as a manufacturer, ran together. And it took some time for Chevy and Toyota to catch on to this, but they're finally starting to catch on. I think Chevrolet is probably at this point probably the furthest behind in that working together, because there just are so many people that are running Chevrolets between you know, all varying different degrees of what they're able to bring to the track. And you know, Toyota seems to be bringing the best cars to the track over their entire stable, are the ones that are able to make it into the Daytona 500. And for Ford, it seems to be the same thing. You only have one or two or three, maybe four teams that, you know, are not as strong as some of the front runners like a Penske or Stewart-Haas Racing. But, you know, Chevrolet is going to have to try and pick this thing up. And with Ricky Stenhouse Jr. being on the pole like he is, Alex Bowman on the outside pole, that you know, they seem to be strong. They seem to be able to they've done a lot of work at JTG Doherty Racing. Good Lord, that's a lot to say.
Say that fast 3 times.
Yeah, right, exactly. So you know, they've worked very, very, very hard and brought Ricky Stenhouse Jr. They brought a fast car, but you know, as we've already talked about, you know, Ricky is, you know, a lot of people look at him in a different degree and how many wrecks that he's caused at these super speedways. So who works with him in the long term, I guess we'll find out, but he seems to at least have a fast car from the get-go.
All right, guys, here comes the time where we got to get your pick for the Daytona 500. Tony Donahue, I think you kind of alluded, you tipped your hat a little bit who you might go with, but you're the betting man in the group. If you're going to put some money on the winner, who's your guaranteed lock it in winner?
Well, you know me, there's no such thing as a guaranteed lock, but I'll go with Denny Hamlin. He's won 2 out of the last 3, I believe, 2 out of the last 4. He's always there at the end. He's got a great pit crew. I like Denny Hamlin. Some value plays that I like. Austin Dillon, Kyle Larson are all 30-1. So is Eric Jones at 30-1. I think that's a good option betting-wise. I'll place my annual bet on Michael McDowell. $10 will pay $80. He's always right there. Michael McDowell on underfunded equipment, but that Furniture Row Racing team with John Hunter Nemechek and David Reagan coming out of retirement, they're a team I think we're going to see lead some laps tomorrow. And then Christopher Bell. Christopher Bell is fast. He's exciting. He's a rookie. He's got a lot to prove. And he's in that number 95 car that led the most laps last year with Matt DiBenedetto behind the wheel. And speaking of DiBenedetto, at 25-1, he's a good pick too in the Wood Brothers 21.
We appreciate that, Tony. And Tony, I know you've got your own podcast and stuff going on with the betting world. It's not just racing. So those people that like to spend a little bit of money, they can catch you where?
Yeah, just follow me on Twitter at Tony D Indy. You'll see the link to my podcast and some of the other stuff I do, and we'll be talking throughout Daytona. And before you know it, IndyCar will be right around the corner with that open test that happened earlier this week.
Real quick, Tony, before we let you go, and then we'll wrap up this segment, Steve. But, Tony, we're going to go back last week to Bloomington. How powerful was that? I went to IU. I was there during the Bobby Knight era. I know we're getting a little bit off track, no pun intended, but I wanted to get your thoughts real quickly on the return of Bobby Knight.
I mean, thank God Bobby Knight returned, right? Because we'd be talking about the crappy performance that was on the floor.
Oh, my gosh.
Which was not very
good.
But it was cool. I got to see Bobby later on the night at the Pacer game.
That's awesome.
You know, people get old, but I'm glad that he was able to come back to IU before things really took a turn for the worse. And it seemed like everybody except for Dan Dockage embraced him. So you kind of have to you kind of got to like that and put a smile on your face, whether you were a Purdue fan or an IU fan.
All right, Tony, we appreciate you. Have yourself a good weekend, sir. Thanks a lot for joining.